is basically a realm of images. You see then with color and light. A higher plane past that, we primarily don't see things, but we hear the tones. At a higher plane closer to the Godhead beyond that, then we primarily can experience it through intuition. And with that, we actually feel the nature of the beings, the planes, etc., that we're connecting to. You have it as an internal knowledge inside of you. It's no longer outside, it's inside. Like they say in the Indian tradition, that art thou, you are that. You know internally the exact nature of the thing that you're connecting with. That is also connected with the idea that in higher realities, in the physical world, physical bodies are always separate. We can never fully interpenetrate. But in higher spiritual planes, that's not true. You can access what appears to be a spiritual being on a higher plane that appears to be one being. And then it begins to peel out, one being after another, out of the composite being. Because these beings can actually move into one composite being at a higher level. It's not like the physical plane. There's no physical separation. If they are of the same resonant quality, they can become one composite being. An idea sometimes called combinescence. Then the next stage is knowledge of the relations between the macrocosm and the microcosm. Now we understand the way that the higher spiritual world and the physical world fit together. It's a continuum. They're not really separate. The astral world is not something out there. The astral world is all around and inside of us all the time. We begin to understand the way macrocosm and microcosm fit together. And then the next stage, we actually have a union with the macrocosm. We can connect to the higher macrocosmic forces. And this is related to higher stages of alchemy, some of the teachings you find in Taoist yoga, a lot of different traditions, when there's actually a union with the macrocosmic forces. And then the final stage is given different terminology in different texts. In one, they would refer to it as attaining blissfulness in God. Another would call it unifying the earlier stages. But essentially at this point of being able to unify with the macrocosm, there is not a separation of oneself from the Godhead. One can completely unify with the nature of the Godhead that's inside of our I Am presence. And this happens as a totality after the transformation of the other lower bodies. So this is the general sense of the 7 Rosicrucian stages. So that then leads to the question of, okay, from this really big picture of how things fit together, what does one actually do as a system of initiation practices? And you can find all types of Rosicrucian work where there are different types of practical applications of the work that they do. It might be hands-on healing. It might be working with the forces in the earth like biodynamics. It might be all kinds of things that are practical applications. But the practical applications all come from a certain type of internal development. And in fact, it's understood in Rosicrucianism and by the Sufis and by other groups that to train in such a way as to try to develop particular types of esoteric spiritual skills or abilities, if you have not developed the foundational transformation of consciousness, is something that's actually not helpful over time. It actually takes you in a very different path if you try to develop the skills rather than having transformed your consciousness to when those new occult powers come up naturally. They'll just develop on their own. So you can find teachers in the Himalayas, the Sufis, etc. They all teach this principle. Don't train for the power, train for the state of consciousness, and then the power will present itself naturally. Depending on the group, there can be different types of prohibitions on the use of powers publicly. The Rosicrucians have a particular prohibition about the use of one's powers to help oneself rather than to help others. It's really done to be put at the service of others. And in some traditions, they don't allow you to make any public demonstration of one's spiritual or occult abilities at all, particularly among classical Sufi groups. They got a very solid prohibition about never do a miracle in public, because that's going to get you the exact type of attention that you don't want. It'll attract the kind of people that are not the people you should be training, the people that are attracted to power, who are attracted to surfaces, not the people that are ready to do the core transformation work. And at another time, there are many wonderful stories about these Sufi saints who can do incredible things, but again, always did their best not to demonstrate it publicly. So, initiation practices. The core of it has to be the awakened self, of attaining directly, from the Christian perspective, directly with the Christ being, which would be essentially the same as in other traditions of connecting to the mind of God, because the Christ being is a macrocosmic being that represents this for us and that directly interacts with us all the time. So one of the most fundamental practices for the Rosicrucians are what they call the 6 basic exercises. Now the 6 basic exercises were talked about by Rudolf Steiner as something that if you did nothing else, do these. Because some types of occult practices that you do could actually end up being harmful to you. But any of those harmful effects could actually be neutralized if you practice the 6 basic exercises. A little bit of background to this. Why are there 6 basic exercises? If you went into the larger context of it, there's the understanding that the different energy centers in the human body have a geometry to them. And so the Hindus teach that the heart center is a 12-petal lotus. In other words, there's a 12-fold differentiation of functions inside the heart center. And so within Rosicrucianism, there are these kind of veiled references to within those 12 centers of the heart. In our previous stages of evolution, we've already developed 6 of them. The other 6 we need to develop now. So every one of these 6 exercises actually develops one of the petals on the heart chakra and helps bring the heart into full activity. That's kind of a hidden layer of this. But in general terms, the 6 basic exercises, the first 3 parts of them are again working with the basic idea that we have 3 basic soul faculties. That's the same thing as saying that our astral body has 3 different aspects: the thinking, the feeling, and the willing. Thought, speech, and action for the Buddhist, head, heart, and hands for the Sufis, upper and middle, lower Dantian for the Chinese Taoist, etc. We have these 3 primary centers: thinking, feeling, and willing. So the first thing we have to do is like what Gurdjieff talked about. We have to begin to self-observe. We have to observe ourselves through the course of the day. We have to observe, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I doing? That act in itself, something also described by the Buddhist in great detail, will actually begin to use the light of our consciousness to illuminate the thinking process, to illuminate our feeling process and our willing process. What this allows us to do is we can then begin to see how much of what we go through every day internally is completely unconscious. It's just one reactive state after another. You get a particular external trigger and you have a particular reaction to it. And so this is the foundation. If you did this, you would end up reaching the goal if you did nothing else. If you don't do this, nothing else you do will matter. You have to do the self-observation, and once you can illuminate, let's say, your thinking process, then, because you can now recognize that moment at which you start to go unconscious. There are these great descriptions in the work of Gurdjieff, particularly from his pupil, P.D. Ouspensky, where Ouspensky has learned from Gurdjieff the process of self-remembering. And he's walking through the streets of St. Petersburg in Russia, and he's so proud of himself because now I can self-remember. What that means is I'm actually aware of myself at this moment. I'm aware of myself walking, I'm aware of myself talking, I'm aware of what I'm thinking and I'm feeling, and he's walking along and everything's great. And then he looks in a shop window and he sees something. And he says, and then I woke up 8 hours later at home. And we often have that experience. You know, we go out to do something, and all of a sudden we wake up and it's hours later, and I went out, I went to work, I went to the store and I bought groceries, I did this other thing, and I realized I've been completely unconscious the whole time. I'm just now becoming self-aware again. Sometimes if you look back on your childhood, there are whole parts of your childhood that most of us can't even remember. But there are parts you do remember. Those are the moments in which you were self-aware. That's why you remember them easily now, compared to those that you don't. So Ouspensky then began to realize this entire process to where we're rarely completely conscious, and it's hard to stay self-aware. And he began to be aware of that threshold between being fully conscious and going to sleep. And that's absolutely critical. So that in our thinking process, it's like I've got my good spiritual persona on, and I'm open-hearted, and I'm dealing with everybody in a beneficial way, and good for me. And then something happens and somebody speaks to me in a way that triggers some emotional response. And then I literally go unconscious and I just respond to them reactively. And the goal is to start seeing that particular boundary point where I go unconscious and catching myself before I pass out. I stay conscious, I stay thinking, and I stay rational. And it's much harder to do than it sounds. And it's that much harder to do with the feeling and the willing, because those are already less conscious than our thinking is. But when we begin to see how much negative feeling we actually harbor about other people and all the things in the world, it's not a pretty picture. And then to see what we actually are doing in the world, This is a thing not only of what we are actually doing, we might do some things that when we begin to review it in a later exercise, we say, ooh, what I did with my will force is what I actually